RMS Titanic was a British passenger liner that sank in the North Atlantic Ocean in 1912 after striking an iceberg during her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York City. Of the estimated 2,224 passengers and crew aboard, more than 1,500 died, making the sinking one of modern history's deadliest peacetime commercial marine disasters. RMS Titanic was the largest ship afloat at the time she entered service and was the second of three Olympic-class ocean liners operated by the White Star Line. She was built by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. Thomas Andrews, chief naval architect of the shipyard at the time, died in the disaster. Titanic was under the command of Captain Edward Smith, who also went down with the ship. The ocean liner carried some of the wealthiest people in the world, as well as hundreds of immigrants from Great Britain and Ireland, Scandinavia and elsewhere throughout Europe who were seeking a new life in the United States. The first-class accommodation was designed to be the pinnacle of comfort and luxury, with a gymnasium, swimming pool, libraries, high-class restaurants and opulent cabins. A high-powered radiotelegraph transmitter was available for sending passenger marconigrams and for the ship's operational use. Although Titanic had advanced safety features such as watertight compartments and remotely activated watertight doors, it only carried enough lifeboats for 1,178 people, about half the number on board, and one-third of her total capacity, due to outdated maritime safety regulations. The ship carried 16 lifeboat davits which could lower 3 lifeboats each, for a total of 48 boats. However, Titanic carried only a total of 20 lifeboats, 4 of which were collapsible and proved hard to launch during the sinking. After leaving Southampton on April 10, 1912, Titanic called at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown, now Cove, in Ireland before heading west to New York. On 14 April, 4 days into the crossing and about 375 miles, 600 kilometers, south of Newfoundland, she hit an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. ship's time. The collision caused the hull plates to buckle inwards along her starboard, right, side and opened 5 of her 16 watertight compartments to the sea. She could only survive 4 flooding. Meanwhile, passengers and some crew members were evacuated in lifeboats, many of which were launched only partially loaded. A disproportionate number of men were left aboard because of a women and children first protocol for loading lifeboats. At 2:20 a.m., she broke apart and foundered with well over 1,000 people still aboard. Just under 2 hours after Titanic sank, the Cunard liner RMS Carpathia arrived and brought aboard an estimated 705 survivors. The disaster was met with worldwide shock and outrage at the huge loss of life and the regulatory and operational failures that led to it. Public inquiries in Britain and the United States led to major improvements in maritime safety. One of their most important legacies was the establishment in 1914 of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, which still governs maritime safety. Several new wireless regulations were passed around the world in an effort to learn from the many missteps in wireless communications, which could have saved many more passengers. The wreck of Titanic was discovered in 1985, more than 70 years after the disaster, during a U.S. military mission, and it remains on the seabed. The ship was split in two and is gradually disintegrating at a depth of 12,415 feet, 3,784 meters. Thousands of artifacts have been recovered and displayed at museums around the world. Titanic has become one of the most famous ships in history, depicted in numerous works of popular culture, including books, folk songs, films, exhibits, and memorials. Titanic is the second largest ocean liner wreck in the world, only beaten by her sister HMHS Britannic, the largest ever sunk. However, she is the largest sunk while in service as a liner, as Britannic was in use as a hospital ship at the time of her sinking. The final survivor of the sinking, Milavina Dean, aged 2 months at the time, died in 2009 at the age of 97. Background. The name Titanic derives from the Titan of Greek mythology. Built in Belfast, Ireland, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, as it was then known, the RMS Titanic was the second of the 3 Olympic-class ocean liners, The first was the RMS Olympic and the third was the HMHS Britannic. Britannic was originally to be called Gigantic and was to be over 1,000 feet, 300 meters, long. They were by far the largest vessels of the British shipping company White Star Line's fleet, which comprised 29 steamers and tenders in 1912. The three ships had their genesis in a discussion in mid-1907 between the White Star Line's chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, and the American financier J. P. Morgan, who controlled the White Star Line's parent corporation, the International Mercantile Marine Company, IMM. The White Star Line faced an increasing challenge from its main rivals Cunard, which had recently launched the Lusitania and the Mauretania, the fastest passenger ships then in service, and the German lines Hamburg America and Norddeutscher Lloyd. Ismay preferred to compete on size rather than speed and proposed to commission a new class of liners that would be larger than anything that had gone before as well as being the last word in comfort and luxury. The company sought an upgrade in their fleet primarily in response to the Cunard giants but also to replace their oldest pair of passenger ships still in service, being the SS Teutonic of 1889 and SS Majestic of 1890. Teutonic was replaced by Olympic while Majestic was replaced by Titanic. Majestic would be brought back into her old spot on White Star Line's New York service after Titanic's loss. The ships were constructed by the Belfast shipbuilders Harland and Wolff, who had a long-established relationship with the White Star Line dating back to 1867. Harland and Wolff were given a great deal of latitude in designing ships for the White Star Line. The usual approach was for the latter to sketch out a general concept which the former would take away and turn into a ship design. Cost considerations were relatively low on the agenda and Harland and Wolff was authorized to spend what it needed on the ships, plus a 5% profit margin. In the case of the Olympic-class ships, a cost of £3 million, £250 million in 2015 money, for the first two ships was agreed plus extras to contract and the usual 5% fee. Harland and Wolff put their leading designers to work designing the Olympic-class vessels. The design was overseen by Lord Peary, a director of both Harland and Wolff and the White Star Line, naval architect Thomas Andrews, the managing director of Harland and Wolff's design department, Edward Wilding, Andrews' deputy and responsible for calculating the ship's design, stability and trim, and Alexander Carlisle, the shipyard's chief draftsman and general manager. Carlisle's responsibilities included the decorations, equipment and all general arrangements, including the implementation of an efficient lifeboat davit design. On July 29, 1908, Harland and Wolff presented the drawings to J. Bruce Ismay and other White Star Line executives. Ismay approved the design and signed 3 letters of agreement 2 days later, authorizing the start of construction. At this point the first ship, which was later to become Olympic, had no name, but was referred to simply as number 400, as it was Harland and Wolff's 400th hull. Titanic was based on a revised version of the same design and was given the number 401. Dimensions and layout. Titanic was 882 feet 9 inches, 269.06 meters, long with a maximum breadth of 92 feet 6 inches, 28.19 meters. Her total height, measured from the base of the keel to the top of the bridge, was 104 feet, 32 meters. She measured 46,328 gross register tons and with a draft of 34 feet 7 inches, 10.54 meters, she displaced 52,310 tons. All 3 of the Olympic-class ships had 10 decks, excluding the top of the officers' quarters, 8 of which were for passenger use. From top to bottom, the decks were the boat deck, on which the lifeboats were housed. It was from here during the early hours of April 15, 1912 that Titanic's lifeboats were lowered into the North Atlantic. The bridge and wheelhouse were at the forward end, in front of the captain's and officers' quarters. The bridge stood 8 feet, 2.4 meters, above the deck, extending out to either side so that the ship could be controlled while docking. The wheelhouse stood within the bridge. The entrance to the first-class grand staircase and gymnasium were located midships along with the raised roof of the first-class lounge, while at the rear of the deck were the roof of the first-class smoke room and the relatively modest second-class entrance. The wood-covered deck was divided into 4 segregated promenades, for officers, first-class passengers, engineers, and second-class passengers respectively. Lifeboats line the side of the deck except in the first-class area, where there was a gap so that the view would not be spoiled. A deck, also called the promenade deck, extended along the entire 546 feet, 166 meters, length of the superstructure. It was reserved exclusively for first-class passengers and contained first-class cabins, the first-class lounge, smoke room, reading and writing rooms and palm court. B deck, the bridge deck, was the top weight-bearing deck in the uppermost level of the hull. More first-class passenger accommodations were located here with 6 palatial staterooms, cabins, featuring their own private promenades. On Titanic, the à la carte restaurant and the Café Parisien provided luxury dining facilities to first-class passengers. Both were run by subcontracted chefs and their staff, all were lost in the disaster. The second-class smoking room and entrance hall were both located on this deck. The raised forecastle of the ship was forward of the bridge deck, accommodating number 1 hatch, the main hatch through to the cargo holds, numerous pieces of machinery and the anchor housings. Aft of the bridge deck was the raised poop deck, 106 feet, 32 meters, long, used as a promenade by third-class passengers. It was where many of Titanic's passengers and crew made their last stand as the ship sank. The forecastle and poop deck were separated from the bridge deck by well decks. C deck, the shelter deck, was the highest deck to run uninterrupted from stem to stern. It included both well decks, the aft one served as part of the third-class promenade. Crew cabins were housed below the forecastle and third-class public rooms were housed below the poop deck. In between were the majority of first-class cabins and the second-class library. D deck, the saloon deck, was dominated by 3 large public rooms, the first-class reception room, the first-class dining saloon and the second-class dining saloon. An open space was provided for third-class passengers. First, second and third-class passengers had cabins on this deck, with berths for firemen located in the bow. It was the highest level reached by the ship's watertight bulkheads, though only by 8 of the 15 bulkheads. E deck, the upper deck, was predominantly used for passenger accommodation for all 3 classes plus berths for cooks, seamen, stewards and trimmers. Along its length ran a long passageway nicknamed Scotland Road, in reference to a famous street in Liverpool. Scotland Road was used by third-class passengers and crew members. F deck, the middle deck, was the last complete deck and mainly accommodated second and third-class passengers and several departments of the crew. The third-class dining saloon was located here, as were the swimming pool, Turkish bath and kennels. G deck, the lower deck, was the lowest complete deck that carried passengers, and had the lowest portholes, just above the waterline. The squash court was located here along with the traveling post office where letters and parcels were sorted ready for delivery when the ship docked. Food was also stored here. The deck was interrupted at several points by overlap, partial, decks over the boiler, engine and turbine rooms. The overlap decks and the tank top below that were on the lowest level of the ship, below the waterline. The overlap decks were used as cargo spaces, while the tank top, the inner bottom of the ship's hull, provided the platform on which the ship's boilers, engines, turbines and electrical generators were housed. This area of the ship was occupied by the engine and boiler rooms, areas which passengers would have been prohibited from seeing. They were connected with higher levels of the ship by flights of stairs. Twin spiral stairways near the bow provided access up to D deck. Features. Power. Titanic was equipped with 3 main engines, 2 reciprocating 4-cylinder, triple expansion steam engines and 1 centrally placed low-pressure Parsons turbine, each driving a propeller. The 2 reciprocating engines had a combined output of 30,000 horsepower, 22,000 kilowatts. The output of the steam turbine was 16,000 horsepower, 12,000 kilowatts. The White Star Line had used the same combination of engines on an earlier liner, the SS Laurentic, where it had been a great success. It provided a good combination of performance and speed, Reciprocating engines by themselves were not powerful enough to propel an Olympic-class liner at the desired speeds, while turbines were sufficiently powerful but caused uncomfortable vibrations, a problem that affected the all-turbine Cunard liners Lusitania and Mauretania. By combining reciprocating engines with a turbine, fuel usage could be reduced and motive power increased, while using the same amount of steam. The two reciprocating engines were each 63 feet, 19 meters, long and weighed 720 tons, with their bed plates contributing a further 195 tons. They were powered by steam produced in 29 boilers, 24 of which were double-ended and 5 single-ended, which contained a total of 159 furnaces. The boilers were 15 feet 9 inches, 4.80 meters, in diameter and 20 feet, 6.1 meters, long, each weighing 91.5 tons and capable of holding 48.5 tons of water. They were heated by burning coal, 6,611 tons of which could be carried in Titanic's bunkers, with a further 1,092 tons in hold 3. The furnaces required over 600 tons of coal a day to be shoveled into them by hand, requiring the services of 176 firemen working around the clock. 100 tons of ash a day had to be disposed of by ejecting it into the sea. The work was relentless, dirty and dangerous, and although firemen were paid relatively generously, there was a high suicide rate among those who worked in that capacity. Exhaust steam leaving the reciprocating engines was fed into the turbine, which was situated aft. From there it passed into a surface condenser, to increase the efficiency of the turbine and so that the steam could be condensed back into water and reused. The engines were attached directly to long shafts which drove the propellers. There were 3, one for each engine. The outer, or wing, propellers were the largest, each carrying 3 blades of manganese-bronze alloy with a total diameter of 23.5 feet, 7.2 meters. The middle propeller was slightly smaller at 17 feet, 5.2 meters, in diameter, and could be stopped but not reversed. Titanic's electrical plant was capable of producing more power than an average city power station of the time. Immediately aft of the turbine engine were 4 400 kW steam-driven electric generators, used to provide electrical power to the ship, plus 2 30 kW auxiliary generators for emergency use. Their location in the stern of the ship meant they remained operational until the last few minutes before the ship sank. Titanic lacked a searchlight in accordance with the ban on the use of searchlights in the merchant navy. Technology. Compartments and funnels. The interiors of the Olympic-class ships were subdivided into 16 primary compartments divided by 15 bulkheads which extended above the waterline. 11 vertically closing watertight doors could seal off the compartments in the event of an emergency. The ship's exposed decking was made of pine and teak, while interior ceilings were covered in painted granulated cork to combat condensation. Standing above the decks were 4 funnels, each painted buff with black tops. Only 3 were functional, the last one was a dummy, installed for aesthetic purposes and also for kitchen ventilation, and 2 masts, each 155 feet, 47 meters, high, which supported derricks for working cargo. Rudder and steering engines. Titanic's rudder was so large, at 78 feet 8 inches, 23.98 meters, high and 15 feet 3 inches, 4.65 meters, long, weighing over 100 tons, that it required steering engines to move it. 2 steam-powered steering engines were installed, though only one was used at any one time, with the other one kept in reserve. They were connected to the short tiller through stiff springs, to isolate the steering engines from any shocks in heavy seas or during fast changes of direction. As a last resort, the tiller could be moved by ropes connected to 2 steam capstans. The capstans were also used to raise and lower the ship's 5 anchors, 1 port, 1 starboard, 1 in the center line and 2 kedging anchors. Water, ventilation and heating. The ship was equipped with her own waterworks, capable of heating and pumping water to all parts of the vessel via a complex network of pipes and valves. The main water supply was taken aboard while Titanic was in port, but in an emergency the ship could also distill fresh water from seawater, though this was not a straightforward process as the distillation plant quickly became clogged by salt deposits. A network of insulated ducts conveyed warm air, driven by electric fans, around the ship, and first-class cabins were fitted with additional electric heaters. Radio communications. Titanic's radio telegraph equipment, then known as wireless telegraphy, was leased to the White Star Line by the Marconi International Marine Communication Company, which also supplied two of its employees, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, as operators. The service maintained a 24-hour schedule, primarily sending and receiving passenger telegrams, but also handling navigation messages including weather reports and ice warnings. The radio room was located on the boat deck, in the officers' quarters. A soundproofed silent room, next to the operating room, housed loud equipment, including the transmitter and a motor generator used for producing alternating currents. The operators' living quarters were adjacent to the working office. The ship was equipped with a state-of-the-art 5 kW rotary spark gap transmitter, operating under the radio call sign NGY, and communication was conducted in Morse code. This transmitter was one of the first Marconi installations to use a rotary spark gap, which gave Titanic a distinctive musical tone that could be readily distinguished from other signals. The transmitter was one of the most powerful in the world, and guaranteed to broadcast over a radius of 350 miles, 563 kilometers. An elevated T antenna that spanned the length of the ship was used for transmitting and receiving. The normal operating frequency was 500 kHz, 600 meters wavelength, however, the equipment could also operate on the short wavelength of 1000 kHz, 300 meters wavelength, that was employed by smaller vessels with shorter antennas. Passenger facilities. The passenger facilities aboard Titanic aim to meet the highest standards of luxury. According to Titanic's general arrangement plans, the ship could accommodate 833 first-class passengers, 614 in second class and 1006 in third class, for a total passenger capacity of 2,453. In addition, her capacity for crew members exceeded 900, as most documents of her original configuration have stated that her full carrying capacity for both passengers and crew was approximately 3,547. Her interior design was a departure from that of other passenger liners, which had typically been decorated in the rather heavy style of a manor house or an English country house. Titanic was laid out in a much lighter style similar to that of contemporary high-class hotels. The Ritz Hotel was a reference point, with first-class cabins finished in the Empire style. A variety of other decorative styles, ranging from the Renaissance to Louis XV, were used to decorate cabins and public rooms in first and second class areas of the ship. The aim was to convey an impression that the passengers were in a floating hotel rather than a ship, as one passenger recalled. On entering the ship's interior, a passenger would at once lose the feeling that we are on board ship, and seem instead to be entering the hall of some great house on shore. Among the more novel features available to first-class passengers was a 7 feet deep saltwater swimming pool, a gymnasium, a squash court, and a Turkish bath which comprised electric bath, steam room, cool room, massage room, and hot room. First-class common rooms were impressive in scope and lavishly decorated. They included a lounge in the style of the Palace of Versailles, an enormous reception room, a men's smoking room, and a reading and writing room. There was an à la carte restaurant in the style of the Ritz Hotel which was run as a concession by the famous Italian restaurateur Gaspargatti. A café Parisien decorated in the style of a French sidewalk café, complete with ivy-covered trellises and wicker furniture, was run as an annex to the restaurant. For an extra cost, first-class passengers could enjoy the finest French haute cuisine in the most luxurious of surroundings. There was also a veranda café where tea and light refreshments were served, that offered grand views of the ocean. At 114 feet long x 92 feet wide, the dining saloon on D-deck was the largest room afloat and could seat almost 600 passengers at a time. Third class, commonly referred to as steerage, accommodations aboard Titanic were not as luxurious as first or second class, but even so were better than on many other ships of the time. They reflected the improved standards which the White Star Line had adopted for transatlantic immigrant and lower-class travel. On most other North Atlantic passenger ships at the time, third-class accommodations consisted of little more than open dormitories in the forward end of the vessels, in which hundreds of people were confined, often without adequate food or toilet facilities. The White Star Line had long since broken that mold. As seen aboard Titanic, all White Star Line passenger ships divided their third-class accommodations into two sections, always at opposite ends of the vessel from one another. The established arrangement was that single men were quartered in the forward areas, while single women, married couples and families were quartered aft. In addition, while other ships provided only open berth sleeping arrangements, White Star Line vessels provided their third-class passengers with private, small but comfortable cabins capable of accommodating 2, 4, 6, 8 and 10 passengers. Third-class accommodations also included their own dining rooms, as well as public gathering areas including adequate open deck space, which aboard Titanic comprised the poop deck at the stern, the forward and aft well decks, and a large open space on D deck which could be used as a social hall. This was supplemented by the addition of a smoking room for men and a general room on C deck which women could use for reading and writing. Although they were not as glamorous in design as spaces seen in upper-class accommodations, they were still far above average for the period. Leisure facilities were provided for all three classes to pass the time. As well as making use of the indoor amenities such as the library, smoking rooms, and gymnasium, it was also customary for passengers to socialize on the open deck, promenading or relaxing in hired deck chairs or wooden benches. A passenger list was published before the sailing to inform the public which members of the great and good were on board, and it was not uncommon for ambitious mothers to use the list to identify rich bachelors to whom they could introduce their marriageable daughters during the voyage. One of Titanic's most distinctive features was her first-class staircase, known as the Grand Staircase or Grand Stairway. Built of solid English oak with a sweeping curve, the staircase descended through 7 decks of the ship, between the boat deck to E deck, before terminating in a simplified single flight on F deck. It was capped with a dome of wrought iron and glass that admitted natural light to the stairwell. Each landing off the staircase gave access to ornate entrance halls paneled in the William and Mary style and lit by Arimelu and crystal light fixtures. At the uppermost landing was a large carved wooden panel containing a clock, with figures of honor and glory crowning time flanking the clock face. The grand staircase was destroyed during the sinking and is now just a void in the ship which modern explorers have used to access the lower decks. During the filming of James Cameron's Titanic in 1997, his replica of the grand staircase was ripped from its foundations by the force of the inrushing water on the set. It has been suggested that during the real event, the entire grand staircase was ejected upwards through the dome. Mail and cargo. Although Titanic was primarily a passenger liner, she also carried a substantial amount of cargo. Her designation as a Royal Mail Ship, RMS, indicated that she carried mail under contract with the Royal Mail, and also for the United States Post Office Department. For the storage of letters, parcels and specie, bullion, coins and other valuables, 26,800 cubic feet, 760 cubic meters, of space in her holds was allocated. The Sea Post Office on G deck was manned by 5 postal clerks, 3 Americans and 2 Britons, who worked 13 hours a day, 7 days a week sorting up to 60,000 items daily. The ship's passengers brought with them a huge amount of baggage, another 19,455 cubic feet, 550.9 cubic meters, was taken up by first and second class baggage. In addition, there was a considerable quantity of regular cargo, ranging from furniture to foodstuffs, and a 1912 Renault Type CE Coupe de Ville motor car. Despite later myths, the cargo on Titanic's maiden voyage was fairly mundane. There was no gold, exotic minerals or diamonds, and one of the more famous items lost in the shipwreck, a jeweled copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, was valued at only £405, £39,400 today. According to the claims for compensation filed with Commissioner Gilchrist, following the conclusion of the Senate inquiry, The single most highly valued item of luggage or cargo was a large neoclassical oil painting entitled La Circassian Aubaine by French artist Marie-Joseph Blondel. The painting's owner, first-class passenger Moritz Haken-Joernstrom Stefansson, filed a claim for $100,000, $2.4 million equivalent in 2014, in compensation for the loss of the artwork. Titanic was equipped with 8 electric cranes, 4 electric winches and 3 steam winches to lift cargo and baggage in and out of the hold. It is estimated that the ship used some 415 tons of coal whilst in Southampton, simply generating steam to operate the cargo winches and provide heat and light. Lifeboats. Like Olympic, Titanic carried a total of 20 lifeboats, 14 standard wooden Harland and Wolff lifeboats with a capacity of 65 people each and 4 Engelhart collapsible, wooden bottom, collapsible canvas sides, lifeboats, identified as A to D, with a capacity of 47 people each. In addition, she had 2 emergency cutters with a capacity of 40 people each. Olympic carried at least 2 collapsible boats on either side of her number 1 funnel. All of the lifeboats were stowed securely on the boat deck and, except for collapsible lifeboats A and B, connected to davits by ropes. Those on the starboard side were odd-numbered 1 to 15 from bow to stern, while those on the port side were even-numbered 2 to 16 from bow to stern. Both cutters were kept swung out, hanging from the davits, ready for immediate use, while collapsible lifeboats C and D were stowed on the boat deck, connected to davits, immediately inboard of boats 1 and 2 respectively. A and B were stored on the roof of the officers' quarters, on either side of number 1 funnel. There were no davits to lower them and their weight would make them difficult to launch by hand. Each boat carried, among other things, food, water, blankets, and a spare life belt. Lifeline ropes on the boat's sides enabled them to save additional people from the water if necessary. Titanic had 16 sets of davits, each able to handle 4 lifeboats as Carlyle had planned. This gave Titanic the ability to carry up to 64 wooden lifeboats, which would have been enough for 4,000 people, considerably more than her actual capacity. However, the White Star Line decided that only 16 wooden lifeboats and 4 collapsibles would be carried, which could accommodate 1,178 people, only 1/3 of Titanic's total capacity. At the time, the Board of Trade's regulations required British vessels over 10,000 tons to only carry 16 lifeboats with a capacity of 990 occupants. Therefore, the White Star Line actually provided more lifeboat accommodation than was legally required. At the time, lifeboats were intended to ferry survivors from a sinking ship to a rescuing ship, not keep afloat the whole population or power them to shore. Had the SS Californian responded to Titanic's distress calls, the lifeboats may have been adequate to ferry the passengers to safety as planned. Building and preparing the ship. Construction, launch and fitting out. The sheer size of Titanic and her sister ships posed a major engineering challenge for Harland and Wolff. No shipbuilders had ever before attempted to construct vessels this size. The ships were constructed on Queen's Island, now known as the Titanic Quarter, in Belfast Harbour. Harland and Wolff had to demolish 3 existing slipways and build 2 new ones, the largest ever constructed up to that time, to accommodate both ships. Their construction was facilitated by an enormous gantry built by Sir William Errol & Co., a Scottish firm responsible for the building of the Forth Bridge in London's Tower Bridge. The Errol gantry stood 228 feet, 69 meters, high, was 270 feet, 82 meters, wide and 840 feet, 260 meters, long, and weighed more than 6,000 tons. It accommodated a number of mobile cranes. A separate floating crane, capable of lifting 200 tons, was brought in from Germany. The construction of Olympic and Titanic took place virtually in parallel, with Olympic's keel laid down first on December 16, 1908 and Titanic's on March 31, 1909. Both ships took about 26 months to build and followed much the same construction process. They were designed essentially as an enormous floating box girder, with the keel acting as a backbone and the frames of the hull forming the ribs. At the base of the ships, a double bottom 5 feet 3 inches, 1.60 meters, deep, supported 300 frames, each between 24 inches, 61 centimeters, and 36 inches, 91 centimeters, apart, and measuring up to about 66 feet, 20 meters, long. They terminated at the bridge deck, B deck, and were covered with steel plates which formed the outer skin of the ships. The 2,000 hull plates were single pieces of rolled steel plate, mostly up to 6 feet, 1.8 meters, wide, and 30 feet, 9.1 meters, long, and weighing between 2.5 and 3 tons. Their thickness varied from 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters, to 1.5 inches, 3.8 centimeters. The plates were laid in a clinkered, overlapping fashion from the keel to the bilge. Above that point they were laid in the in and out fashion, where strake plating was applied in bands, the in strakes, with the gaps covered by the out strakes, overlapping on the edges. Commercial oxy-fuel and electric arc welding methods, ubiquitous in fabrication today, were still in their infancy. Like most other iron and steel structures of the era, the hull was held together with over 3 million iron and steel rivets, which by themselves weighed over 1,200 tons. They were fitted using hydraulic machines or were hammered in by hand. In the 1990s, some materials scientists concluded that the steel plate used for the ship was subject to being especially brittle when cold, and that this brittleness exacerbated the impact damage and hastened the sinking. It is believed that, by the standards of the time, the steel plate's quality was good, not faulty, but that it was inferior to what would be used for shipbuilding purposes in later decades, owing to advances in the metallurgy of steel making. As for the rivets, considerable emphasis has also been placed on their quality and strength. One of the last items to be fitted on Titanic before the ship's launch was her 2 side anchors and 1 center anchor. The anchors themselves were a challenge to make, with the center anchor being the largest ever forged by hand and weighing nearly 16 tons. 20 Clydesdale draft horses were needed to haul the center anchor by wagon from the Noah Hingley and Sons Limited forge shop in Netherton, near Dudley, United Kingdom, to the Dudley railway station 2 miles away. From there it was shipped by rail to Fleetwood in Lancashire before being loaded aboard a ship and sent to Belfast. The work of constructing the ships was difficult and dangerous. For the 15,000 men who worked at Harland and Wolff at the time, safety precautions were rudimentary at best. A lot of the work was carried out without equipment like hard hats or handguards on machinery. As a result, during Titanic's construction, 246 injuries were recorded, 28 of them severe, such as arms severed by machines or legs crushed under falling pieces of steel. 6 people died on the ship herself while she was being constructed and fitted out, and another 2 died in the shipyard workshops and sheds. Just before the launch, a worker was killed when a piece of wood fell on him. Titanic was launched at 12:15 p.m. on May 31, 1911 in the presence of Lord Peary, J. Pierpont Morgan, J. Bruce Ismay and 100,000 onlookers. 22 tons of soap and tallow were spread on the slipway to lubricate the ship's passage into the River Lagan. In keeping with the White Star Line's traditional policy, the ship was not formally named or christened with champagne. The ship was towed to a fitting out berth where, over the course of the next year, her engines, funnels and superstructure were installed and her interior was fitted out. Although Titanic was virtually identical to the class's lead ship Olympic, a few changes were made to distinguish both ships. The most noticeable exterior difference was that Titanic, and the third vessel and class, Britannic, had a steel screen with sliding windows installed along the forward half of the A-deck promenade. This was installed as a last-minute change at the personal request of Bruce Ismay, and was intended to provide additional shelter to first-class passengers. Extensive changes were made to B-deck on Titanic as the promenade space in this deck, which had proven unpopular on Olympic, was converted into additional first-class cabins, including 2 opulent parlor suites with their own private promenade spaces. The à la carte restaurant was also enlarged, and in the Café Parisien, an entirely new feature which did not exist on Olympic, was added. These changes made Titanic slightly heavier than her sister, and thus she could claim to be the largest ship afloat. The work took longer than expected due to design changes requested by Ismay and a temporary pause in work occasioned by the need to repair Olympic, which had been in a collision in September 1911. Had Titanic been finished earlier, she might well have missed her collision with an iceberg. Sea trials. Titanic's sea trials began at 6 a.m. on Tuesday, April 2, 1912, just 2 days after her fitting out was finished and 8 days before she was due to leave Southampton on her maiden voyage. The trials were delayed for a day due to bad weather, but by Monday morning it was clear and fair. Aboard were 78 stokers, greasers and firemen, and 41 members of crew. No domestic staff appear to have been aboard. Representatives of various companies traveled on Titanic's sea trials, Thomas Andrews and Edward Wilding of Harland and Wolff and Harold A. Sanderson of IMM. Bruce Ismay and Lord Peary were too ill to attend. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride served as radio operators, and performed fine-tuning of the Marconi equipment. Francis Carruthers, a surveyor from the Board of Trade, was also present to see that everything worked, and that the ship was fit to carry passengers. The sea trials consisted of a number of tests of her handling characteristics, carried out first in Belfast Lough and then in the open waters of the Irish Sea. Over the course of about 12 hours, Titanic was driven at different speeds, her turning ability was tested and a crash stop was performed in which the engines were reversed full ahead to fullest turn, bringing her to a stop in 850 yards, 777 meters, or 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The ship covered a distance of about 80 nautical miles, 92 miles, 150 kilometers, averaging 18 knots, 21 miles per hour, 33 kilometers per hour, and reaching a maximum speed of just under 21 knots, 24 miles per hour, 39 kilometers per hour. On returning to Belfast at about 7 p.m., the surveyor signed an agreement and account of voyages and crew, valid for 12 months, which declared the ship seaworthy. An hour later, Titanic departed Belfast to head to Southampton, a voyage of about 570 nautical miles, 660 miles, 1060 kilometers. After a journey lasting about 28 hours, she arrived about midnight on 4th of April and was towed to the port's berth 44, ready for the arrival of her passengers and the remainder of her crew. Maiden voyage. Both Olympic and Titanic registered Liverpool as their home port. The offices of the White Star Line as well as Cunard were in Liverpool, and up until the introduction of the Olympic, most British ocean liners for both Cunard and White Star, such as Lusitania and Mauretania, sailed out of Liverpool, followed by a port of call in Queenstown, Ireland. Since the company's founding in 1845, a vast majority of their operations had taken place out of Liverpool. However, in 1907 White Star Line established another service out of the port of Southampton on England's south coast, which became known as White Star's Express Service. Southampton had many advantages over Liverpool, the first being its proximity to London. In addition, Southampton, being on the south coast, allowed ships to easily cross the English Channel and make a port of call on the northern coast of France, usually at Cherbourg. This allowed British ships to pick up clientele from continental Europe before recrossing the Channel and picking up passengers at Queenstown. The Southampton-Cherbourg New York run would become so popular that most British ocean liners began using the port after World War I. Out of respect for Liverpool, ships continued to be registered there until the early 1960s. Queen Elizabeth II was one of the first ships registered in Southampton when introduced into service by Cunard in 1969. Titanic's maiden voyage was intended to be the first of many transatlantic crossings between Southampton and New York via Cherbourg and Queenstown on westbound runs, returning via Plymouth and England while eastbound. Indeed, her entire schedule of voyages through to December 1912 still exists. When the route was established, 4 ships were assigned to the service. In addition to Teutonic and Majestic, the RMS Oceanic and the brand new RMS Adriatic sailed the route. When the Olympic entered service in June 1911, she replaced Titanic, which after completing her last run on the service in late April was transferred to the Dominion Line's Canadian service. The following August, Adriatic was transferred to White Star Line's main Liverpool-New York service, and in November, Majestic was withdrawn from service impending the arrival of Titanic in the coming months, and was mothballed as a reserve ship. White Star Line's initial plans for Olympic and Titanic on the Southampton run followed the same routine as their predecessors had done before them. Each would sail once every 3 weeks from Southampton and New York, usually leaving at noon each Wednesday from Southampton and each Saturday from New York, thus enabling the White Star Line to offer weekly sailings in each direction. Special trains were scheduled from London and Paris to convey passengers to Southampton and Cherbourg respectively. The Deepwater Dock at Southampton, then known as the White Star Dock, had been specially constructed to accommodate the new Olympic-class liners, and had opened in 1911. Crew. Titanic had around 885 crew members on board for her maiden voyage. Like other vessels of her time, she did not have a permanent crew, and the vast majority of crew members were casual workers who only came aboard the ship a few hours before she sailed from Southampton. The process of signing up recruits had begun on 23rd of March and some had been sent to Belfast, where they served as a skeleton crew during Titanic's sea trials and passage to England at the start of April. Captain Edward John Smith, the most senior of the White Star Line's captains, was transferred from Olympic to take command of Titanic. Henry Tinglewald also came across from Olympic to take the post of chief mate. Titanic's previously designated chief mate and first officer, William McMaster Murdoch and Charles Lightoller, were bumped down to the ranks of first and second officer respectively. The original second officer, David Blair, was dropped altogether. The third officer was Herbert Pitman MBE, the only deck officer who was not a member of the Royal Naval Reserve. Pitman was the second to last surviving officer. Titanic's crew were divided into 3 principal departments: deck, with 66 crew; engine, with 325, and victualling, pronounced Vitaling, with 494. The vast majority of the crew were thus not seamen, but were either engineers, firemen, or stokers, responsible for looking after the engines, or stewards and galley staff, responsible for the passengers. Of these, over 97% were male, just 23 of the crew were female, mainly stewardesses. The rest represented a great variety of professions: bakers, chefs, butchers, fishmongers, dishwashers, stewards, gymnasium instructors, laundrymen, waiters, bedmakers, cleaners, and even a printer, who produced a daily newspaper for passengers called the Atlantic Daily Bulletin with the latest news received by the ship's wireless operators. Most of the crew signed on in Southampton on 6th of April. In all, 699 of the crew came from there, and 40% were natives of the town. A few specialist staff were self-employed or were subcontractors. These included the 5 postal clerks, who worked for the Royal Mail and the United States Post Office Department, the staff of the first-class à la carte restaurant and the Café Parisien, the radio operators, who were employed by Marconi, and the 8 musicians, who were employed by an agency and traveled as second-class passengers. Crew pay varied greatly, from Captain Smith's £105 a month, equivalent to £10,200 today, to the £3.10s, £340 today, that stewardesses earned. The lower-paid victualling staff could, however, supplement their wages substantially through tips from passengers. Titanic's passengers numbered approximately 1,317 people, 324 in first class, 284 in second class, and 709 in third class. Of these, 869, 66%, were male and 447, 34%, female. There were 107 children aboard, the largest number of whom were in third class. The ship was considerably under capacity on her maiden voyage, as she could accommodate 2,453 passengers, 833 first class, 614 second class, and 1,006 third class. Usually, a high-prestige vessel like Titanic could expect to be fully booked on its maiden voyage. However, a national coal strike in the UK had caused considerable disruption to shipping schedules in the spring of 1912, causing many crossings to be cancelled. Many would-be passengers chose to postpone their travel plans until the strike was over. The strike had finished a few days before Titanic sailed, however, that was too late to have much of an effect. Titanic was able to sail on the scheduled date only because coal was transferred from other vessels which were tied up at Southampton, such as SS City of New York and RMS Oceanic, as well as coal Olympic had brought back from a previous voyage to New York, which had been stored at the White Star dock. Some of the most prominent people of the day booked a passage aboard Titanic, traveling in first class. Among them, with those who perished marked with a dagger, were the American millionaire John Jacob Astor IV and his wife Madeline Force Astor, industrialist Benjamin Guggenheim, painter and sculptor Francis Davis Millard, Macy's owner Isidor Straus and his wife Ida, Denver millionairess Margaret Molly Brown, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife, Couturier Lucy, Lady Duff Gordon, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Buchan, writer and historian Archibald Gracie, cricketer and businessman John B. Thayer with his wife Marion and son Jack, George Dunton Widener with his wife Eleanor and son Harry, Noel Leslie, Countess of Roths, Mr. and Mrs. Charles M. Hayes, Mr. and Mrs. Henry S. Harper, Mr. and Mrs. Walter D. Douglas, Mr. and Mrs. George D. Wick, Mr. and Mrs. Henry B. Harris, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur L. Ryerson, Mr. and Mrs. Hudson J. C. Allison, Mr. and Mrs. Dickinson Bishop, noted architect Edward Austin Kent, brewery Harry Molson, tennis players Carl Bear and Dick Williams, author and socialite Helen Churchill Candy, future lawyer and suffragette Elsie Bowerman and her mother Edith, journalist and social reformer William Thomas Stead, journalist and fashion buyer Edith Rosenbaum, Philadelphia and New York socialite Edith Corse Evans, wealthy divorcee Charlotte Drake Cardoza, French sculptor Paul Chevre, author Jacques Futrell with his wife May, silent film actress Dorothy Gibson with her mother Pauline, president of the Swiss Bank of Orion Colonel Alphonse Simonius Bloomer, James A. Hughes's daughter Eloise, banker Robert Williams Daniel, the chairman of the Holland America line Johan Reuchlin, Arthur Wellington Ross's son John A. Ross, Washington Roebling's nephew Washington E. Roebling II, Andrew Sachs's daughter Layla Sachs Meyer with her husband Edgar Joseph Meyer, son of Mark Eugene Meyer, William A. Clark's nephew Walter M. Clark with his wife Virginia, great-great-grandson of soap manufacturer Andrew Pears, Thomas C. Pears with wife, John S. Pillsbury's honeymooning grandson John P. Snyder and wife Nell, Dorothy Parker's New York manufacturer Uncle Martin Rothschild with his wife, Elizabeth, among others. Titanic's owner J.P. Morgan was scheduled to travel on the maiden voyage but cancelled at the last minute. Also aboard the ship were the White Star Line's managing director J. Bruce Ismay and Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews, who was on board to observe any problems and assess the general performance of the new ship. The exact number of people aboard is not known, as not all of those who had booked tickets made it to the ship. About 50 people cancelled for various reasons, and not all of those who boarded stayed aboard for the entire journey. Fares varied depending on class and season. Third-class fares from London, Southampton, or Queenstown cost £7.5, equivalent to £700 today, while the cheapest first-class fares cost £23, £2,200 today. The most expensive first-class suites were to have cost up to £870 in high season, £85,000 today. Collecting passengers. Titanic's maiden voyage began on Wednesday, April 10, 1912. Following the embarkation of the crew, the passengers began arriving at 9:30 a.m., when the London and South Western Railway's boat train from London Waterloo Station reached Southampton Terminus Railway Station on the quayside, alongside Titanic's berth. The large number of third-class passengers meant they were the first to board, with first and second-class passengers following up to an hour before departure. Stewards shows them to their cabins, and first-class passengers were personally greeted by Captain Smith. Third-class passengers were inspected for ailments and physical impairments that might lead to their being refused entry to the United States, a prospect the White Star Line wished to avoid, as it would have to carry anyone who failed the examination back across the Atlantic. In all, 920 passengers boarded Titanic at Southampton, 179 first class, 247 second class, and 494 third class. Additional passengers were to be picked up at Cherbourg and Queenstown. The maiden voyage began at noon, as scheduled. An accident was narrowly averted only a few minutes later, as Titanic passed the moored liners SS City of New York of the American Line and Oceanic of the White Star Line, the latter of which would have been her running mate on the service from Southampton. Her huge displacement caused both of the smaller ships to be lifted by a bulge of water and then drop into a trough. New York's mooring cables could not take the sudden strain and snapped, swinging her around stern first towards Titanic. A nearby tugboat, Vulcan, came to the rescue by taking New York under tow, and Captain Smith ordered Titanic's engines to be put full astern. The two ships avoided a collision by a matter of about 4 feet, 1.2 meters. The incident delayed Titanic's departure for about an hour, while the drifting New York was brought under control. After making it safely,